So, some of the things that do count towards government spending would be when the government is spending money on like government services. So, if they were to invest in schools or libraries or parks or invest in infrastructure, um, those kinds of things would increase GDP. That would count towards this government spending category. If they spend more money with like defense, then that would add towards GDP because something new is being generated there. All right. The fourth category is something called net export. So this is where we add in the influence of our global trade, right? If GDP only measures what's produced in the country, we also want to look at what happens when we're buying things from outside of the country, the imports that we bring in versus the exports. So in order to find this, we always take exports minus imports. Okay, how much we are sending out into the world minus what we're bringing into the country. So if we notice that exports are greater than imports, we have what's called a trade surplus. This would add and increase a country's GDP because that means that they are producing more within their country and sending it out into the world than what they are bringing in. If we notice that a country has more imports and less exports, they would have what's called a trade deficit. So this would decrease GDP because, again, what this means is that you're bringing more product into the country than what you're making yourself. And so that lowers GDP. Okay, so we can again take all this information, add it together, and that will give us an idea of what is happening with GDP. So, what I want you to do is go to this lesson page for today, and we're going to take a look at the first two links that are here. So, on the first link, this BEA website, you're going to go here, click on GDP and personal income, begin using the data, and then open up section 1 and go to table 1.1.5. So this is going to give you information for GDP since the beginning of 2019. Okay, so every quarter, every 3 months, the BEA calculates this information and they post it. And so we can go back and again see what was happening every quarter for as far back as you want to go, since they've been calculating it anyways. So on line 1 is the total GDP. So this is adding all four components together and what are you left with, or what's the total of them. Okay, so we can then go through and compare and see, okay, from quarter 1 to quarter 2 there was growth, 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 a decline, growth, and then so on. Okay, so when we're looking at this, if we notice, hey, from quarter 4 to quarter 2, there's two quarters of GDP decline. That is officially a recession. Okay, a recession is anytime you have two or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP. So a 6-month or longer period would cause a recession. Now, you'll notice that ever since then, our GDP has been increasing. So that was a very small recession. It was what we call an artificial recession because it's not something that happened because something was wrong with the economy. It was forced because if you notice, this happened at the beginning of 2020. This is when the lockdowns were going in for COVID, when businesses were shutting and people weren't working. So that affects investment, consumption, and net exports because those happening across the country or across the world. And so we saw that decline. Once the lockdown stopped and people went back to work, that's when we see the growth start happening again. Okay. Now, the rest of the lines, 2 and down, are the individual components here. So the ones that are bolded are our four main categories. So consumption, line 2, investment, line 7, net exports, line 15, and government spending, line 22. Okay, within those categories, they break them down even further. So, for example, in consumption, we can spend our money on goods or services, and so we can go through there and compare those numbers. So, as we're looking at lines 3 and line 6, you'll notice that we spend more money in the United States on services than we do actual goods. Okay, so that isn't very surprising. You can also see what kinds of things factor into investment, exports minus imports, and then government spending, right? Federal and then state and local, right? All added together here. So if we're looking at this information, what you'll notice every time is that consumption makes up roughly 68%, 70% of GDP for each year. Okay. That next major component is government spending, which makes up about 18% of government spending, or sorry, of GDP, followed then by investment, which is like a 17.5%. And then you'll notice that our net exports is a negative number. That indicates that we have a trade deficit. Our exports are less than our imports. Okay, so you'll notice that we always run a trade deficit. We import a lot more products than we grow. Okay, so we can use this information again to see what's happening within our system. And then we can also compare our country to the rest of the world because every country calculates this relatively the same. So go ahead and click on that second link, and it's going to take you to this website here. And then I want you to just scroll down below this graph, and it's going to list out the countries with their GDP numbers as of 2020. So you'll notice that the United States has the largest economy, right? Our GDP is the highest in the world, right? So that means we have the largest economy, we have the most influence within economies across the globe. Even number two, China, is 14 trillion. So that is a $6 trillion difference, which is quite a bit. And so we're able to have a little bit more influence over them. You'll notice on these little graphs here, this will show you how GDP has been trending. And so both countries are seeing growing GDPs, growing economies. Followed then by Japan, Germany, the UK, France, and India, right? And you can see that these numbers are all much smaller. Even between number 5, UK, and number 1, United States, that's a like $10 trillion difference, which is again a lot of money. So you can scroll through this list and see kind of where countries fall. Now, again, some of the reasons for this is because there's not a lot of manufacturing. It could be there's really bad government policies. It could be that um, all kinds of things, right? There's more government programs, so it doesn't add to GDP. Each country is just a little bit different, right? So again, we can compare this and say, okay, because we have the largest economy, we can use that towards political ends as well. We can tell countries we don't like what you're doing with this political or social thing, and so we're going to use economic sanctions. We're not going to trade with you, or we're going to put maybe higher trade taxes or whatever the case may be in place until you stop this action. So because we have the largest economy, we're able to do those things. All right, so that's it for GDP. Tomorrow we're going to talk about inflation in the next video, so come back for that.